It is the afternoon of the 1st of March, 1945, and on a shallow rise of frozen Pomeranian farmland, roughly 220 men sit their horses in the tree line, waiting. Below them, across half a mile of open ditch-scarred fields, the village of Schoenfeld burns in patches where Polish shells have already found their mark. It has not been enough. Tanks of the Polish Armoured Brigade lie stalled in the mud, bogged past their tracks in ground too soft to carry them, too exposed to let their crews climb out and push. Infantrymen of the 2nd Infantry Division are pinned flat in the wet grass, unable to lift their heads without drawing fire from a hill numbered, with grim military plainness, Hill 157. Somewhere behind that hill, dug into a line of concrete and wire the Germans call the Pomeranian Wall, riflemen and anti-tank gunners of the German 163rd Infantry Division wait for the attack to die, as attacks against fortified villages so often did in this war, in the mud, under fire, going nowhere. And then, from the trees, a flare goes up. The men in the tree line are Uhlans of the 3rd Regiment, 1st Warsaw Independent Cavalry Brigade, and the sound that follows the flare is one the war has almost forgotten how to make. Not engines, not tank tracks grinding over frozen ruts. Hooves, 2 squadrons draw sabers, form their line, and go forward at the canter, then the gallop, out of the woods and across open ground raked by machine gun fire, towards a village the tanks and the infantry could not take. It is, by any reasonable account, one of the last full cavalry charges fought against a modern, entrenched enemy anywhere in the world, and it is happening in the closing weeks of the Second World War in Europe, at a moment when the outcome of that war was no longer seriously in doubt. Nazi Germany has perhaps 10 weeks left to live, and yet here, on a forgotten hillside north of Poznan, men are still riding into rifle fire with drawn steel, because it is the only tool left that might actually work. This is the story of that charge, of the brigade that made it, the battle that demanded it, and the strange, stubborn fact that even in 1945, with jet aircraft flying and atomic weapons weeks from existing, there were still afternoons when the fastest way to break a line was still, in the end, a horse. It is a story, too, about timing. Almost every account of the last cavalry charges of the Second World War describes desperate men in losing positions, throwing horses at machine guns because there was nothing else left to throw. What happened at Schoenfeld was different in one crucial respect. It happened to a winning army, in a winning campaign, at a moment when the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in serious doubt anywhere on the continent. That single fact changes the meaning of the whole afternoon, and it is a large part of why historians of cavalry warfare keep returning to this particular village rather than to any of the more famous last stands. By early 1945, the war in Europe had become a war of momentum. The Red Army and its Polish allies, fighting as the First Army of the Polish People's Army under Soviet operational control, were driving north and west through Pomerania in what would be recorded as the East Pomeranian Offensive, a campaign intended to clear the Baltic coastal provinces, secure the approaches to Stettin, and eliminate the threat that German forces still holding the coast might strike into the flank of the main Soviet drive on Berlin. The Wehrmacht, for its part, had spent the winter converting this coastal strip into a defensive belt the Germans themselves referred to, with a certain bleak pride, as the Pomeranian Wall, a patchwork of concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified villages, built to slow an advance that could no longer be stopped, only delayed. Schoenfeld sat directly on the third line of that wall, and it sat, crucially, on slightly higher ground than the fields around it, which meant that whoever held the village held the fire lanes across the whole approach. The problem facing the Polish First Army on the 1st of March was not a shortage of firepower. It was terrain. The ground in front of Schoenfeld was low, waterlogged farmland, thawing under a late winter sun into exactly the kind of soft, boggy soil that swallows tank tracks and turns a rifleman's advance into a crawl through freezing mud. An initial assault by tanks and infantry of the 2nd Infantry Division had gone in that morning and simply come apart in the wetlands below the village, unable to close the distance while German infantry and anti-tank guns fired down from Hill 157 with almost total command of the open ground. Armor that cannot maneuver is armor that can be picked off at leisure, and by early afternoon the attack had stalled entirely, the tanks stuck fast, the infantry unable to advance or usefully retreat, and the Germans of the 163rd Infantry Division still very much in possession of the village they had been ordered to hold. It is worth being honest about what this meant in practical terms. A modern army, in the final spring of the most mechanized war in history, had thrown its tanks and its infantry at a single fortified village and failed to take it. This was not, in itself, an unusual event by early 1945. The whole of the Pomeranian Wall had been designed precisely to produce this kind of stalemate, buying the collapsing German front a few extra hours or days at every fortified point along its length. What made Schoenfeld a problem worth solving quickly was the wider tempo of the offensive. Commanders needed the village cleared that day, both to maintain the momentum of the push towards Stettin and the Baltic coast, and to avoid leaving a strengthened German position sitting astride the line of advance overnight, giving the defenders darkness in which to bring up reinforcements, replace losses, and dig in still further. Waiting was not, in this context, a cost-free option, and every hour the tank sat stuck in the mud below Hill 157 was an hour in which the German garrison inside Schoenfeld grew, relatively speaking, stronger rather than weaker. There is also a simpler, harder truth buried in the failure of that morning's attack, one worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. Mechanization, for all its advantages, had a specific and well-understood weakness, and that weakness was exactly the kind of ground the Poles found themselves fighting over on the 1st of March. Tanks need firm ground to maneuver. Take that away through thaw, marsh, or ditch-cut farmland, and 30 tons of armor becomes an immobile target rather than a weapon. Wehrmacht planners, laying out the Pomeranian Wall's defensive lines the previous winter, had chosen ground like this deliberately, citing strongpoints such as Schoenfeld precisely where the terrain would punish an attacker's armor and reward a defender's fixed positions. It was, in its own grim way, good defensive planning, and with the ground defeating the tanks and the infantry pinned by fire they could not usefully answer, the only formation still capable of crossing that ground at speed was one that, on paper, belonged to an earlier war entirely: the cavalry. The 1st Warsaw Independent Cavalry Brigade was one of the last formations of its kind fielded by any combatant army in the Second World War, and its presence in the order of battle in 1945 owed less to nostalgia than to the simple fact that horses could still do things that tanks, bogged in Pomeranian mud, could not. Polish cavalry had a long and, by 1939, badly misunderstood history. The popular image of Polish lancers charging German panzers head-on in September 1939 is largely a piece of wartime propaganda, invented and spread by German sources at the time and repeated ever since, and it flattens a much more sensible reality. Polish cavalry brigades that autumn had genuinely fought hard and had genuinely charged, but their charges were typically directed against infantry or armored cars caught in the open, not against tanks head-on, and horses were used chiefly for the speed and mobility to strike and disengage rather than for suicidal charges into armor. Actions such as the charge at Krojanty in the campaign's opening days, or the stand of the Wałęsa Cavalry Brigade at Mokra, showed cavalry fighting largely dismounted, using horses as transport to a firing position rather than as a weapon in themselves. By 1945, reconstituted under the command structure of the Polish People's Army fighting alongside Soviet forces, the Warsaw Brigade retained that older cavalry logic, adapted to a war that had moved on considerably since 1939. Horses got men and light guns across ground quickly that motor transport simply could not cross at all in a Pomeranian thaw. Once there, the men fought largely on foot with rifles and machine guns, or, when the moment genuinely demanded it, mounted with saber, pistol, and grenade. It was not, by 1945, a first resort. It was a specialist tool, kept in reserve for exactly the kind of terrain and tempo problem that presented itself outside Schoenfeld that afternoon. At Schoenfeld, that moment arrived in the early afternoon. 2 squadrons of the 3rd Uhlan Regiment, supported by mounted artillery batteries drawn from the brigade's own guns, formed up at the edge of the woodland overlooking the stalled battle below, roughly 220 horsemen in total by the more careful accounts of the action, a modest force by the standards of earlier cavalry warfare, but a formation still built, trained, and equipped for exactly this kind of shock action. Sabres were drawn. The line formed, and on a signal, the Uhlans put their horses forward, first at a trot, then a canter, then, as they broke from the tree line into open ground, a full gallop, crossing perhaps half a mile of exposed, ditch-cut farmland under machine gun and rifle fire from the German positions ahead. What makes a cavalry charge work, even against automatic weapons, is a brutal calculation about time and target. A horse at the gallop closes several hundred meters in well under a minute, far faster than infantry can cross the same ground on foot, and fast enough that a defending machine gunner, however well sighted, has only a handful of seconds to track a moving, weaving target before it is on top. Picture the arithmetic a defender faces: a rifleman who might comfortably hold a fixed line of advancing infantry under fire. For several minutes, suddenly has perhaps 30 or 40 seconds of usable engagement time against a mounted line covering the same ground, and every second of that window is spent adjusting aim against a target that is both closing distance and moving unpredictably. It is not that the charge is safe. Men and horses were killed in those minutes, and accounts of the action record Polish losses in the charge itself. 7 Uhlans killed and around 10 wounded by the time the line reached the village. It is that the charge is fast enough to matter, in a way that a man crawling through mud or a tank stuck to its axles simply is not. The Uhlans crossed the killing ground, broke into Schoenfeld, and the fighting that followed was close, brutal, and largely hand-to-hand. Sabres, pistols, grenades thrown into houses and trench lines, cavalrymen and German infantry fighting at a range where rifles and machine guns lose much of their advantage, and the contest comes down to nerve and proximity. Mounted artillery batteries, brought forward with the charge, added their own weight to the assault. Their guns able to keep pace with the horsemen in a way that towed artillery, restricted to roads and firmer ground, simply could not. Smoke, where accounts mention it, gave the horsemen brief cover as they crossed the most exposed stretch of open field. Beyond that, the charge succeeded or failed on speed alone. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. By the end of the afternoon, Schoenfeld had fallen. Total Polish casualties across the whole action, the earlier failed tank and infantry assault as well as the cavalry charge that finally broke the position, came to roughly 147 dead and close to 300 wounded, a heavy toll for a single village. German losses were recorded as considerably higher, more than 500 dead and around 50 men taken prisoner, with the surviving defenders of the 163rd Infantry Division forced out of a position that had held through an entire morning of conventional assault. The village that tanks could not take and infantry could not hold ground in front of, fell within perhaps half an hour of horsemen reaching its edge. It is not, on the strength of the wider war, a battle that changed very much. It was one fortified village among hundreds cleared during the East Pomeranian offensive that spring. But it is remembered, both in Poland and in the wider history of cavalry warfare, as something close to a full stop, the closing of a chapter of military history that had, by any sensible measure, already ended. Set this action against the other cavalry charges of the Second World War, and its place becomes clearer still. In August 1942, on the banks of the Don, the Italian Savoia Cavalleria Regiment had ridden down a Soviet infantry position at Izbushensky, a charge often cited in isolation as the last great cavalry action in history, though it predates Schoenfeld by 2.5 years, and the Poles' own charge is frequently argued, by military historians who study these things closely, to be the more credible claimant to that title, being both later and unambiguously successful in seizing its objective outright. American cavalry had made its own last mounted charge 3 years earlier, still in January 1942, when the 26th Cavalry Regiment of the Philippine Scouts rode down Japanese positions near Morong on the Bataan Peninsula, a genuinely desperate action fought in a losing campaign, rather than a winning one. British cavalry, for its part, had fought its final mounted charge that same March of 1942 in Burma, where Captain Arthur Sandeman led his men against Japanese machine guns outside Toungoo in an action that cost every rider his life, Sandeman included. Set against these, the charge at Schoenfeld stands out for a simple, almost paradoxical reason. It came latest, it worked most cleanly, and it happened not in the desperation of retreat or defeat, but in the final, confident, forward momentum of an army that was, by March 1945, unmistakably winning. That timing is really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. Cavalry had been dying as a battlefield arm since the machine gun and the motor vehicle first reshaped warfare a generation earlier, and by 1945, every major combatant had all but abandoned the horse for anything resembling a frontline combat role. That the Polish army still fielded a functioning cavalry brigade at all in the war's final spring reflects both the particular demands of fighting through the wetlands and forests of Pomerania, where mechanized transport frequently could not go, and a certain institutional continuity in Polish military tradition that had survived occupation, exile, and reconstitution under Soviet command. The charge at Schoenfeld was not a throwback deployed out of romantic attachment to an obsolete arm. It was, by the account of the men who ordered it that afternoon, the most sensible tool available for a specific, urgent tactical problem. Ground too wet for tanks, fire too heavy for infantry, and a village that needed taking before nightfall. Its legacy since has been shaped as much by symbolism as by tactics. The Polish cavalry tradition, associated in popular memory, not always accurately, with the doomed courage of September 1939, found in the charge at Borusko something closer to vindication, a cavalry action that actually worked, mounted by the successors of the brigades that had fought, and often died, in the opening weeks of the war 6 years earlier. Where the charges of 1939 had, in the popular telling at least, come to symbolize brave futility against an unstoppable modern enemy, the charge at Schoenfeld offered a different, quieter kind of ending. The same arm, the same tactics, deployed one final time against a defended position, and this time simply winning. Today, a plaque set into a boulder near the edge of the modern village, now known as Rzęsko, marks the site of the charge, and Polish historical reenactment groups have, in recent years, staged annual commemorations of the action close to its anniversary, riders in period uniform crossing the same fields at the gallop for an audience that comes to watch history rather than fight it. It remains, so far as military historians have been able to establish, the last occasion on which cavalry rode down a fortified, mechanized enemy position and won. That claim deserves one honest caveat. Precisely because the last cavalry charge is such an appealing phrase, it has been applied at various times to at least half a dozen different actions. The Italian charge at Izbushensky, the American charge at Bataan, the British charge at Toungoo, and several smaller Polish and Soviet actions besides. Military historians continue to debate which of these deserves the title outright, and reasonable arguments exist for more than one candidate depending on how strictly the criteria are drawn. Full regimental strength, unambiguous tactical success, engagement against a prepared enemy position rather than a routed one. What can be said with more confidence is that Schoenfeld is the latest of the credible candidates, the only one to occur in the war's final spring rather than its earlier, more desperate years, and very likely the last time a cavalry charge, in the traditional sense, took a defended objective and held it. What should stay with you from this story is not really the sabers or the horses, striking as that image is. It is the timing. This charge did not happen in some earlier, more innocent phase of the war before tanks and aircraft had proven their worth. It happened in March 1945, with Berlin 10 weeks from falling, with the war's outcome effectively settled, at a moment when almost every other army on Earth had already quietly retired the horse from combat. And it worked, not because horses were still, in some general sense, superior to tanks — they plainly were not and never would be again — but because on one specific afternoon, on one specific patch of frozen Pomeranian mud, they were faster than the alternative, and fast was what the moment required. The charge at Schoenfeld earned no lasting place in the grand strategy of the Second World War. It secured one village on one afternoon in a campaign that would be won regardless of whether that village fell that day or the next. But it stands, all the same, as one of history's cleanest full stiops, the closing line of an entire chapter of warfare that had been dying, by inches, for 30 years, since the first machine guns had turned the charges of an earlier century into slaughter. Tanks had failed that morning. Infantry had failed that morning. And, in the final weeks before victory, it was the oldest weapon in any army's arsenal that finally broke the line. Men, horses, and the nerve to close the distance before the guns could find them. Picture it, once more then, as we began, the flare going up over the tree line. 220 men drawing sabers in the cold March air, 5.5 years almost to the week since Polish cavalry had last charged in anger, against a very different enemy, in a very different war. The gallop across open ground raked by fire, the village falling within the half-hour where tanks and infantry had failed for an entire morning. It was, in every sense that matters, the last charge before the last victory. And it worked.